Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind Headlines. And in this programme tonight, we'll be talking about the warnings made by the US administration, together with the British government and the international government, for Israel not to retaliate over 350 rockets, missiles, drones, including ballistic and cruise missiles that were fired at Israel on the early hours of Sunday, the 14th of April. Well, on Friday, the 16th of April, Israel responded, and we're asking, is that enough to deter Iranian aggression? And what is the true story behind the Iranian missile attack on Israel? And in today's programme, I'm joined by my good friend, Robin Benson. So Robin, so pleased that you can join me for Behind the Headlines.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to take part.
Absolutely. So, I mean, what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is nothing less than extraordinary, Robin. The fact that it's unprecedented territory when the Iranian regime launched 350 rockets, drones, including cruise and ballistic missiles at Israel, in which Israel's president of Israel, Isaac Herzog, described this as a declaration of war. And yet what we see is that Israel has responded, but many critics are saying this is nowhere near enough to deter Iranian aggression, will actually embolden them. What do you make of this extraordinary events that occurred a couple of weekends ago when the Iranians launched this unprecedented missile attack from their own soil on Israel, and the whole world was able to watch through various different TV news channels?
Well, I mean, Israel allegedly took out these 7 or 8 senior Iranian military on the attack on the building next door to the Iranian consulate in Damascus on the 1st of April. That actually is the trigger point that set all of these events in motion. Because from that point onwards, the Iranians were saber rattling, were warning that there would be retaliation. I mean, that was on a daily basis. So I suppose in many respects, most of the rest of the world knew something was coming. We had no idea when it was going to come, but the Iranians were making it crystal clear that they weren't going to take that particular attack on their senior military, you know, lying down, sitting down, whatever the expression is. So I mean, I don't know whether you have, but from my time in Israel, I have the Red Alert app on my mobile phone. And I'm sitting at home that Saturday night watching the television, and all of a sudden it's pinging, ping, 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 ping. And I think, what on earth is going on? I look at it. Headlines were already, this was about 8:30, 9 o'clock our time that night. So already headlines were beginning to appear in some of the English-speaking Israeli news feeds that Israel was under attack. Now, nothing had arrived at that point, but obviously they can scan these things far enough in advance, or so we understand. And so it was anticipated. And that went on until 1 o'clock in the morning. I stayed up until the pinging basically or either slowed down or stopped, and that was about 1 p.m. on Sunday morning our time. So it was all over.
1 a.m., sorry.
1 a.m., sorry, 1 a.m., I beg your pardon, 1 a.m. Sunday morning. So all through that time, this was just regularly happening. More and more alerts were going up all over Israel during that time.
Yeah, I remember watching on Sky News, it was breaking probably about 8 o'clock, and it was just very surreal that the world's media and TV networks were able to announce that the Iranians have launched these rockets and drones from their own territory to target Israel. I think none of us really knew what to expect, praying that God would protect his nation at this very vulnerable time. And of course, then Israel's claiming a victory by claiming that they intercepted 99% of all those rockets, missiles, drones, including ballistic and cruise missiles. But let's, as we can see with that incredible footage over Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock, the interception of these Iranian drones. So the Telegraph reports this week that the Iranian missile and drone attack on Israel cost the Israeli taxpayer equivalent of $1 billion US, or 804 million to defend Israel from the Iranian attack. So on Friday, the 19th of April 2024, the Israeli Air Force responded to the Iranian missile attack on Israel by firing several missiles at an Iranian missile defense installation. And according to ABC News, reported that the Israeli missile strike was launched outside of Iranian territory and was aimed at a radar site near the city of Isfahan that protects the Natanz nuclear facilities. And according to an unnamed Israeli official, the airstrike was Iran's attempt to display its military prowess and its ability to strike at the heart of the regime without escalating the situation. We should be asking whether Israel's strike deep into Iranian territory will be enough to avert war in the Middle East. And we also see, for example, we have to put this in context, and you know, this is broken down. So on Saturday, the 13th of April, the Iranian regime fired 350 missiles, drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles in an unprecedented direct attack on Israel. Approximately 5 a.m. on Friday, the 19th of April, IDF drones attacked a radar base in Isfahan, that is 75 miles south of Natanz, Iran's main nuclear site, and 274 miles south of Tehran. And of course, this is a developing story that's developing. And also, the Telegraph reports that Israel launched missiles at the Iranian nuclear defenses. Now, clearly, the Israelis were under incredible pressure by the Biden administration not to escalate. We've also seen that David Cameron was out in Jerusalem last week, our Foreign Secretary, warning Israel not to retaliate and to take the win. And I guess Israel was showing that they were bowing to Western pressure not to retaliate in full measure against the Iranian regime, even though it was a declaration of war. And then we see also that the Israelis wanted to send the Iranian message that they could take out their air defenses and they could strike at Iran's nuclear facilities and bases. So what do you make of everything that's really kind of unfolded since? And now it seems that the Iranians have said they're not going to respond with further action, and the whole situation now seems to be de-escalated, whilst the Biden administration and David Cameron and the Foreign Office are taking a diplomatic victory, and the Israeli government can say we protected the Israeli people from these drones, even though it cost the Israeli taxpayer nearly $1 million to do so.
Yeah, I mean...
Oh, sorry, nearly $1 billion.
Yeah. I mean, the whole thing is crazy in so many respects, because everybody is coming out of this having supposedly won in some form or other. The Iranian regime has won because it's, even though it seems a catastrophe in the sense that so little got through, it nevertheless has won because it launched all of that. And therefore, in the eyes of the people in Iran who support the regime, that's a plus. The allies, if you want to use the expression, including Israel, have had a win because they were so successful in thwarting the attack. And of course, Israel has had a win in getting these projectiles through into Iran. So on the surface, everybody seems to have come out smelling like roses out of the whole thing. But as you and I have discovered in the research for this program over the last couple of days, and we'll get to that, that's not necessarily the case. But I think maybe the two major things that have come from it, at least so far in our discussion, is that Iran has shown to Israel and its allies, we can actually mass attack you. Whatever the result was, Iran could create the situation where it sent that high number of projectiles. But Israel has also proven, well, we can circumvent and we can beat your defense systems. Now, actually, the initial news that sort of came out on the 19th was what you described, but it's since been clarified in that actually Israel apparently fired 2 missiles at a Russian S-300 air defense unit. With the first missile, it took it out, so they self-detonated the second missile because it wasn't needed. The other thing that Israel did apparently was to attack air defense units in Syria that then allowed the Iranian attack to be successful. So in all of this, Israel, even though there is absolute uproar in Israel over the lack of response, both from the public, and there's all sorts of shouting going on inside the coalition government, that Israel has not done enough. Nevertheless, Israel can project to the rest of the world, we have shown Iran that we can circumvent their systems anytime we want.
But certainly didn't show any fear against the Iranian regime. So let's have a look and actually look to the week building up to Israel's response against Iran's unprecedented missile and drone attack on Israel. And this excellent CBN news report is entitled Netanyahu's response to new Iranian threats. We will make our own decisions. Take a look.
Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says world leaders want the Jewish state to go easy in striking back at Iran after it attacked with more than 300 drones and missiles.
But I want to make clear that we will make our own decisions, and the state of Israel will do all that is needed to defend itself.
Wednesday, Iran's president warned Israel will face a massive and harsh response for any invasion of its territory, threatening, quote, the complete annihilation of the Zionist regime. Israel says it will be ready.
We are preparing ourselves for the next time, debriefing the mission and seeing how could we prepare ourselves for the next attack if it would come.
After Israel's air defense forces destroyed 99% of incoming drones and missiles, Rabbi Yitzhak Adlerstein tells CBN News there's only one way to explain its tremendous success.
We were all witness to nothing short of a miracle of biblical proportions. I think it's going to take a little while for the full effect of it, for the facts to set in.
Israel is now facing another threat on the diplomatic front. Friday, the UN Security Council will hold a vote on a Palestinian request for full membership. That move, which could lead to recognition of a Palestinian state, is expected to be blocked by the U.S. Meanwhile, families of the Israeli hostages in Gaza got a boost when Time magazine named American-Israeli Rachel Goldberg Poland as one of the top 100 most influential people of 2024. Her 23-year-old son Hirsch was kidnapped and remains in Gaza. She told CBN News, "Hope in God is very important."
My faith gives me tremendous hope. I don't know how I could do this without knowing that someone is in charge of this whole complicated, painful, difficult situation.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
That was courtesy of our friends at CBN, who are doing a fantastic job on reporting on Israel and the Middle East, certainly at the current time. I just want to draw your attention to a really interesting article that the Daily Telegraph actually announced. So Daily Telegraph published an article, and this was their headline: Israel launched missiles at Iranian nuclear defenses. It says that Israeli fighter jets fired several missiles at an air defense installation protecting the Iranian nuclear facility during Friday's morning attack, a senior US official has said. The salvo was launched from outside of Iranian territory and aimed at a radar site near the central city of Isfahan that is tasked with protecting the Natanz nuclear complex, according to the unnamed official cited by NBC News. The official described it as an Iranian attempt to display the Israeli attempt to display its capabilities to strike Iran without escalating the situation. Initial assessment of the strike stated that the air defense station had been destroyed, the official said, while adding that the report had yet to be finalized. The Natanz complex is reported to be Iran's primary uranium enrichment facility. Now let's have a look at the breakdown of events that occurred on Friday, the 19th of Israel, as Israel struck back against the unprecedented attack by Iran regarding rockets and also drones. So Israeli fighter jets fired missiles at Iran and in a muted show of force early on Friday morning. The attacks reportedly targeted the air defense systems of a key nuclear plant in the country. The attack was aimed near the central city of Isfahan, home to the Iranian military base. Tehran almost immediately played down the attack as reckless fireworks. Italy's foreign minister Tajini told reporters at the G7 summit that the Jewish state had alerted Washington at the last minute. Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, said Washington was committed to de-escalating and trying to bring this tension to a close. Let's have a look at the time frame. So at 9:25 p.m., Netanyahu reprimands security minister for calling the Iran strike lame. Israeli media says Benjamin Netanyahu has reportedly dressed down Itamar Ben-Gvir, the hard-right Israeli security minister, after Ben-Gvir described the Israel strike on Iran as lame. According to Channel 12, an Israeli TV station, Netanyahu told the security minister that his actions had harmed national security. And after reports of Israel's limited strikes on Iran emerged early on Friday, Mr. Ben-Gvir quickly dismissed his country's operation with a single word posted on X that was roughly translated as lame. And Mr. Ben-Gvir had previously called on the Israeli military to go berserk on Iran. So we're already seeing, aren't we, here, that within Israel's response, that Israel said that she would respond to the Iranian missile attack, despite pressure from the Biden administration and also the British government not to do so. And we see that in the words of Itamar Ben-Gvir, the security minister, this was a lame attack. So we see that publicly he's attacked Benjamin Netanyahu and effectively called the attack lame, which is showing that this is causing divisions within Benjamin Netanyahu's own kind of religious cabinet of his coalition government. So what are your thoughts on the outspoken words of Itamar Ben-Gvir? Not surprising.
Yes, I mean, yeah, Mr. Ben-Gvir's response probably should have been taken for granted, but it is the heart reaction of many Israelis to what, I mean, Simon, if that had happened here in the UK, that would have been taken as a declaration of war.
I don't think we would have done anything. It's the same thing.
I'm not sure that we would, but it's a to send that many projectiles from Iran to Israel is a declaration of war. And I can completely understand Ben-Gvir and his allies in the religious parties in the coalition government, as well as many in the Israeli population, just scratching their heads and thinking, is this our deterrence? Is this the best that we can do to ensure that our chief enemy in the Middle East, in fact in the world, doesn't even think about doing what they did, 6 days previously? And you can understand the anger and frustration.
But we also got to come to the realization that the Iranian regime was also one of the architects of October the 7th. So they were very much involved in the planning, the operation, the training, and also the training of those Hamas terrorists who carried out the worst massacre against the Jewish people since the Holocaust. So we can see, for example, that there was huge anger, particularly amongst the Israeli military establishment, I could imagine, from Benjamin Netanyahu's response, because it was imperative that Israel sent the Iranians a message, because in the Middle East, it's all about the perception of strength. If you are seen as strong, you won't be attacked. But if you're seen as weak, then you're more open to attack. So this does nothing really to help Israel's deterrent capabilities.
I mean, one of the things that we need to bring into this equation is to go back to April the 1st and the attack on that building next to the consulate. And that the main person that they took out, Zahidi from the Republican Guard, in his death notice in the Iranian press, he is lauded, praised as being one of the chief architects of October the 7th. That's what the Iranians had to say about this guy. So that makes it clear, as far as I can see, to the rest of the world that these denials on the part of the Washington administration and even our own government that the Iranians had no hand in it are nonsense. They're a blatant lie. The Iranians themselves, I mean, I know, yes, it is part of sort of Arab and Islamic culture, to overblow things, but it's nevertheless the case that this is a stated fact as far as they're concerned. So now we understand why that building was attacked, and that particular man and the 6 or 7 with him were taken out. That was Israel's response to October the 7th, to the chief architect. But of course, then it creates this chain of events that we've seen unfold in the last 14 days or so.
Which has taken Israel by surprise. I don't think Israel expected the Iranians to fire 350 missiles, drones. They knew there'd be a response, but didn't realize the magnitude of that response. And had the Iranians not given warning and this was a surprise attack, it might have been very different. We also see the hand of God's protection over Israel during this, the fact that we saw 99% of those rockets and missiles and drones were intercepted, but does leave question marks regarding what happened to the cruise missiles that came over. And we can unpack that a little bit later, but I think it's important that we understand, for example, this is for the technical side of the program, about Iran's 1970s and Cold War air defense systems, and this is what proves that Iran is essentially a paper tiger. It's all mouth. So we see here the the Telegraph reports that Soviet-era technology and 1970s American jets inside Iran's aging air defense. Tehran has long boasted about the country's arsenal, but there are major doubts over its military capabilities. So the Time writes, the Israel strike on Iran early on Friday appears to have been limited. The Iranian regime will likely be breathing a sigh of relief. Its aging air defense systems will struggle to stand up to a substantial aerial bombardment on the scale launched by Tehran last week. Iran is reliant on a string of locally developed missile defense batteries in the Soviet-era hardware, as well as American and British equipment that was stationed in the country before the Islamic Revolution occurred in 1979. The article goes on to say that the systems are incompatible with Israel's modern Iron Dome surface-to-air defense system, which helped Israel deflect hundreds of Iranian missiles and drones with the help of American, British and French fighter jets. Iran's system is largely built around the Russian S-200 and S-300 missile systems, as we can see on screen, which were first put into operation in the 1960s and 70s. The latest model was said to be able to down incoming aircraft, drones and missiles at the range of 93 miles. The Iranian officials have acknowledged that the Soviet-era kit is complemented by domestically produced Bavar 373 systems. They claim that the system's radar component can detect and track up to 60 targets as far as 280 miles away. Its missile launchers are said to be able to engage 6 targets at once at a range of 186 miles. We can see them on screen now. And also we see that a guy called Sid Hoth, a research fellow at the Royal United Strategic Institute think tank, has argued that penetrating Iran's air defense is not the main challenge for Israel. He actually argues that the Iranian air defense is certainly not impenetrable to those aircraft, but raises the risk of losses and Iranian capacity to act, at least in theory. So I think what we're seeing here really is that, and this is what this Israel's response has proved, is that the Iranian regime main strength comes from its terror proxies, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, its support for the Al-Qaeda leadership and asymmetrical warfare. But we also see that over time the Iranian regime has built up weapons, as we saw that was attacked on Israel, the rockets and missiles and cruise missiles. But clearly we know that Iran's air defense system is archaic. And only take a few American airstrikes or Israeli airstrikes to really turn Iran, really take it back to the Stone Age, essentially.
That's true, but there are other factors here that I think probably the same articles that you and I have read and researched on this, is that Israel has this Iron Dome sort of multi-layered system of protection, which again came in very useful on April 13th and 14th. But as one technical expert has pointed out, that those systems, as with many of the other Western systems, are predicated on sending interceptors up to intercept before the missile comes down, the attacking missile. Whereas some of the missiles that Iran used and others that they claim to have, these supersonic and hypersonic, travel in a straight line. They don't go up and then come back down again. And nobody's systems at the present time, not even Israel's, are able to intercept those. So this is a major flaw in the whole of the Israeli defensive system, as it is in many Western systems. So that's an issue that Israel is going to have to address somehow as it thinks through and looks through what Iran launched on April the 13th and 14th.
Also, the same article goes on to say that Iran's Air Force is a particularly weak point in any potential conflict with Israel. Tehran is believed to have only a few dozen working strike aircraft, including the Russian jets and US-made F-4s and F-5s that were acquired before the revolution in 1979. Of course, Israel has the latest Americans' F-35s. They also report that it has a squadron of 9 F-4s and F-5 fighter jets, 1 squadron of Russian-made Sukhoi 24 jets, and some MiG-29s, F-7s and F-14 aircraft. Iran's strength is believed to lie in the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, stockpiles of ballistic and cruise missiles. And at least half of the missiles that Iran fired at the weekend were said to have failed before reaching Israel, raising doubts over the claim of the ability of its domestically built air defense system. So in light of this, surely the Israelis missed a golden opportunity to strike at the heart of the regime. And knowing that the Iranian regime is very close to developing nuclear weapons, as we see that the UN watchdog is warning that they're very close, wasn't this kind of a missed opportunity last Friday to strike fear at the heart of the regime? We know, for example, that the Iranian people themselves are oppressed, and this wouldn't be an attack against the Iranian people, but against this totalitarian theocratic regime that resides in Tehran, that is a complete menace not only to the Middle East, but the entire free world.
Yes, I agree with you, Simon, and that's something that we always have to bear in mind when we have these discussions, that the bulk of the Iranian people don't want this at all. It's a minority amongst the people and the ruling regime that is pushing forward this this jihadist, almost genocidal end times, Islamic end times viewpoint, the 12ers, who are wanting to usher in the return of the Islamic Messiah, who know that you have to create chaos in the world in order for him to be welcomed back. They're part of the theological thinking that none of or most of our Western governments don't even take into account. But again, another factor in all of this that we need to take into account is the fact that Iran has all of these proxies: Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis. You've got Hezbollah-related groups in Syria and Iraq. And if the numbers are correct, Hezbollah has somewhere between 150,000 and 200 projectiles. Some of those are just, homemade stuff, but some of them are guided munitions. And if Iran so chooses, Hezbollah could totally overwhelm Israel's Iron Dome system by sending so many rockets one after the other. So probably the bigger challenge that Israel faces at the present time is getting Hamas sorted out in Gaza Strip and then dealing with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And after that, then maybe they'll have to turn their attention towards Iran if Iran hasn't come in behind its proxies elsewhere.
Absolutely, and the big challenge for Israel is the fact that we have a very weak president in Joe Biden that wants to pacify, and he also very much is in fear of the Iranian regime. And this whole fear that paralyzes the Democrats, that they are afraid to use force to back up diplomacy. And that is American power. America is a world superpower. And if you back up your statements or your words or diplomacy with force, that's what gives America its power. And I think it's this failure to recognize that America has this military might and power, not to intimidate the world or to incite wars or to advance the American dominance around the world, but in other words, to preserve the peace and stability, particularly in the Middle East. And this Biden administration has failed to do that. They believe that by entering into negotiations, this is how you reach your political goals, through negotiations, whether they are through the clerics of the Iranian regime, who they believe that they can coerce into an agreement, and believe that the Iranians will keep their agreement, showing the power of diplomacy without backing that up by force, unlike the Trump administration prior to Biden. So I think this is the situation that we find ourselves in. So let's have a look now at this excellent report that Israel struck back against the Iranian regime on Friday, the 14th of April.
The Iranian Tasnim news agency reported the assault took place in the southeastern part of the city near its nuclear energy mountain. Isfahan is the site of one of Iran's major nuclear sites, enriching uranium for Iran's nuclear program. According to the Jerusalem Post, the attack in Isfahan was carried out with long-range missiles launched from aircraft, not drones or land-air missiles. An Iranian official told Reuters there is no plan for an immediate response. It is not clear who is behind the attack. An Iranian TV anchor downplayed the attack and quoted a military official in Isfahan.
He did confirm that there were some loud sounds that were heard in the east of the city of Isfahan, and this was related to the air defense system, as we told you and our viewers before, triggered by the presence of 3 small drones that were present in that area.
On local television, other reporters near the area showed how quiet and normal Isfahan looks. Middle East expert Avi Milliman told CBN News Iran seems to be minimizing the story on purpose. Yonah Bob, Jerusalem Post military correspondent and author of the book Target Tehran, told CBN News the strike sends a clear message.
The message behind the strike from Israel was, Iran, you cannot do what you did last weekend. You attacked Israel directly. You attacked with 350 aerial threats, 170 drones, 120 ballistic missiles, 30 cruise missiles. That cannot happen again. If it does, you will suffer, and you will suffer large.
Bob also says the attack was calibrated to avoid a regional war and represents a crossroads to Israel and Iran.
This is a unique moment. There was a shadow war between Israel and Iran that we talk about in our book, Target Tehran, for a long time. The question now is, will we go back to that shadow war, or has the paradigm been crushed? And even though Israel isn't officially taking credit for what happened today, will there be additional direct exchanges between Iran and Israel? We will only know that going forward.
The attack in Isfahan took place on the 85th birthday of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Meanwhile, some analysts are saying that Israel's response was measured, only enough to give an answer to the Iranian attack. That's because it's preparing to enter the last Hamas stronghold in the city of Rafah in Gaza to complete the goal of finishing off Hamas and its leadership and getting the hostages back. IDF troops are still operating in the central Gaza Strip, eliminating terrorists and striking military compounds, observation posts and rocket launchers and launching points. They've also destroyed 17 tunnel shafts.
So the big question is, will it happen again? And has Israel done enough to deter Iranian missile aggression? I think that's open to debate. Now, what's really interesting is that we have a very kind of angry response from an excellent journalist. His name is Jake Wallace Simmons. He's the editor of the Jewish Chronicle. He also writes for the Daily Telegraph, and he wrote under this banner, which says that Israel has just handed Iran a major victory. Iran's foreign policy is based on a principle of increments. It inches forward little by little, and each time we fail to bite back. Now he goes on and he argues that Israel's strike on Isfahan, did it achieve its objectives? He says it's too early to tell, but the first indications are that if no further action is to follow, then it's unlikely to have done so. Do you want to read what else he also wrote?
He goes on to say, if there is one adjective that has been attached To the assumed Israeli retaliation in recent days, it is limited, in inverted commas. It has been used by the Americans, it has been used by the Israelis, and it was used by the British diplomats I spoke to who returned from Israel on Thursday. Limited is all very well. It plays nicely to the international community who are congenitally bent on holding Israel to a draw. But it will hardly strike fear into the heart of the Iranian regime. You know, that's true. You know, what actually happened, he questions. At the time of writing, explosions were heard early on Friday morning near Isfahan in central Iran. The city is home to a variety of military targets, including the subterranean Natanz nuclear site, which has been targeted repeatedly by Mossad. It also hosts an airbase which is thought to have been the target of the strikes. The attack is thought to have been carried out by drones rather than missiles or airstrikes, although that's become clarified since he wrote this, perhaps launched from within Iran itself. Jerusalem has not yet taken responsibility for the operation, providing deniability with an inbuilt exit from the spiral of escalation. The full details are yet to come, but what was that really it? Question. Was that really the only response to hundreds of missiles and drones fired at Israel last week, costing a reported $1 billion or £804 million in defences and demanding an international response? If the price for such an assault is one limited jab at an airbase, then that is extremely favourable to Iran. The lesson for the Ayatollah is clear. Next time, double the payload. It's worth it. After years of American appeasement, Tehran has learned that its adversary sees deterrence as an alien concept. The White House is quite happy to work around its own sanctions legislation to release pots of cash to the regime. It is quite happy to engage in interminable nuclear talks while failing to halt Tehran's progress toward a bomb. It is quite happy to play defense, even having the temerity to call it a win, in inverted commas, but when it comes to hitting back, it is cowardly. Wow, he really pulls no punches.
Well, I think he needs to, because you know what we see really from Iranian aggression is that this is now a serious threat to the West. I mean, if Iran is able to send 350 rockets, missiles, and drones, including ballistic and cruise missiles at Israel, and really face no consequences for it, what is Iran going to be like when Iran has nuclear weapons? Knowing that the Iranian regime's fingerprints are all over 9/11, according to the 9/11 Commission report that was published after the horrific attacks on 9/11. We know that they've been coordinating and bringing Al-Qaeda together with the leadership of Hezbollah. We know that despite the theological differences and their sworn enemies, the Sunnis, they work with Sunni terrorist organizations such as Hamas. As we saw in an earlier part of the program, you gave evidence that the Iranians were directly almost the architect of October the 7th. We also see, for example, the Iranian regime is the horrendous abuser of human rights. You only have to look at the women's protests all over Iran to realize the hostility and the brutality of the regime against their own people, including Christians. We see that they are the #1 supporter of international terrorism around the world. And do the American administration really think that they can enter into negotiations, calm the situation for now, and think that they can make an agreement with this Iranian regime over its nuclear weapons program, which they have no intention of honouring, and they never had it in the first place. So if you see that if the West now, really it's almost like an hour to midnight, and the regime, once it has nuclear weapons, will be unstoppable. So essentially having nuclear weapons will shore up their support of their regime, knowing that any Israeli or an American attack on this regime will essentially mean a kind of nuclear war. And also then the Iranians are then able to supply the proxy terrorist organizations with dirty bombs, and there's no reprisal without fear of a nuclear escalation. So, I mean, I don't know how the decisions being made within the White House and also Israel, knowing that Israel can't rely on the United States for security. Israel has to rely on the God of Israel for security, but also has to look at some of the ideology of the founding fathers of the modern state of Israel, which was the iron fist or the iron wall ideology, that Israel has to strike hard in the neighborhood of the Middle East in order to survive. And it's only the strongest survive. So surely now Israel had an opportunity to go it alone, which was a declaration of war, and literally take out Iran's nuclear facilities and say, okay, what have you got? Because sooner or later, we're going to see war in the Middle East. And it's a question of, is it in Israel's timings, or will this be in Iran's timing, when Iran will be stronger and more deadlier, maybe in a few months or even a year's time than Iran is now?
Wow. I mean, okay, again, there are several threads in what you said. From our perspective as Bible-believing Christians who have an understanding of what the God of Israel is doing, some understanding of what the God of Israel is doing in the world today, we see that is God's purpose, that Israel as a nation state is totally dependent on Him. And yet we see the reality is that Israel, right at this point in time as a nation state, is almost totally dependent on the United States, because it gets the bulk of its armaments and its defense via the United States. I mean, Israel pays for it, it doesn't get it for free, but it still gets it from the United States. So it is attached to the United States apron strings. There's a sense, I think, amongst some of us that part of what is happening at the present time is God's way of cutting those apron strings, but it is going to be a very painful process for Israel and the Jewish people to come to that point where they are more reliant on the God of their forefathers than they are even on themselves and their own brilliant technology, plus the American help. But we also got the situation where we have a failed Obama policy being resurrected, or the attempt to breathe life back into it by the Biden administration. It's a continuation of what Obama started in trying to buy off the Iranians. And the Iranians just love it, because the billions are pouring into their coffers, and what are they doing? They're turning it around and feeding it into all of these proxies that are making life hell for Israel and in many other parts of the world as well. So, you know, we have the crazy situation where we have an American administration that seems, pardon the expression, hell-bent on creating World War III, even though that's not what they want. But that's where they're moving the rest of us because of the stupidity and the blindness that there is in the White House administration.
Absolutely, and also I think it's the failure to actually build on the foundation that the Trump administration made in the Middle East with the Abraham Accords. If you look, they decided that every policies that Trump did, we have to reverse. So with the Abraham Accords and with threat of an American military response on Iran, we see, for example, the Iranian regime was on its knees economically, on the verge of collapse. Hezbollah were complaining that they were running out of money. ISIS was defeated in Syria and northern Iraq. And for the first time in what seems like decades, we had a relative peace and stability in the Middle East, with the prospects of Israel signing a normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia was on the cards. And we've seen a complete reversal of that policy by, instead of anchoring it on American foreign policy backing Israel and the Saudis as their main allies in the Middle East, decided to back the Iranian regime as their main allies together with that of the Palestinian Authority and the refunding of the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian cause. So of course, and the regime having billions in sanctions relief then resulted in them having more money in the pockets to plan and arm and attack October the 7th. So when you look at the kind of geostrategic situation, this situation has got worse and was made worse by Biden's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of 2021, which leads us to this place now that Israel now is under so much pressure from the Biden administration not to act unless the Americans give the Israelis the green light. So according to the Times of Israel, they've reported that the original plan was a big military target outside of Tehran. says Israel's originally retaliatory plan against Iran included a much wider counterstrike on military targets, including near Tehran. The New York Times has reported on Monday, citing 3 Israeli officials. So such a broad and damaging attack would have been far harder for Iran to overlook, increasing the chances of a forceful Iranian counterattack, the paper said. As has been widely reported, Israel shelved plans for an immediate response to Iran's unprecedented direct attack on April 13th, 14th, when it became clear that Israel had thwarted most of the Iranian missiles and drones with the help of the US-led coalition. And after a telephone call that night between US President Joe Biden and the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Now this brings us into this very interesting part of the programme, Robin, and this is a fascinating report that you showed me from Avner Bosky, and his ministry is entitled the Final Frontier Ministries, and he has produced this extremely interesting report on the Iranian missile strike on Israel. Just gives us a synopsis of what he's effectively saying.
So Avner is a senior leader in the community of Messianic believers in the land of Israel. He's a pastor. My understanding is that his fellowship is down in the Negev area. So he's a well-respected man amongst the believing community in the land of Israel. He's not some, cook, all right? And he has done due diligence, trawling through news sites, government spokespersons' websites since, certainly since April the 13th, but looking back, he goes back further than that. And a very quick synopsis of what he has put out in the first 2 reports that he has written is that what happened on the night of April the 13th, the early hours of the 14th, was pre-arranged between the Biden administration and the Tehran regime. In other words, the US government, military, intelligence, you name it, the president himself, knew that Iran was going to attack on April the 13th. They knew what the level of attack would be, and they knew some of the targets of the attack. So they had pre-informed the British, the French, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, Saudi Arabia and the United Emirates already knew, and they were feeding intelligence to the allies, let's call them that. And Israel was eventually informed some hours before I think about 24 hours or thereabouts before the attack actually started. So all of these nations had both their military and intelligence paraphernalia in place before the attack even started. So this was not a surprise attack to those who were in the know. To the rest of us, of course, it was. To the bulk of the Israeli public, it was. But those who were in the know knew it was coming, and more or less knew on the level, because Iran was communicating with the White House via Turkey, via, we think, the Swiss. Yep. So there were intermediaries involved, but the information was flowing back and forward between the different parties. And what happened on the 13th and 14th was not a major surprise.
Also, he reports, which is really interesting, that I haven't picked up anywhere else, that the cruise missiles that were discovered in Israel actually breached Israeli airspace.
Yes, about 20 of them.
We saw one big one out that landed in the Dead Sea, for example, then found out that they didn't actually have much of a payload. So in other words,
I think the normal payload is, from what I've read, is somewhere in the region of 450 kilos of high explosive. All of these had no more than 20 kilos of high explosive in the warheads. In other words, they were empty to all intents and purposes. And what little damage they did was, thank God, and I mean that genuinely, no one was killed. We had this one Bedouin girl, 7-year-old girl, who was hit by shrapnel from an intercept somewhere near Arad. But that was the whole point. The whole point was that no one got killed. That any missiles that got through were aimed at military installations as making a point. That's all it was about, making a point and testing the Israeli defenses.
So, the big question is how, for example, has the Biden administration allowed the Iranians to do that without then, as being part of CENTCOM, saying Israel is one of our top allies. The Saudis are concerned about this. The Jordanians are very concerned about this, particularly as he also mentions in his article about how the Iranians are planning a coup in Jordan to overthrow the Hashemite regime.
The Iranians have armed up to 12,000 Jordanians, and that actually was news at least 2 weeks before. Avner even mentioned it in his article. I mean, I've read that elsewhere, with the purpose of trying to, yes, as you say, overturn the current Jordanian government and bring Jordan under the Iranian umbrella, as well as Iraq, Syria, and Yemen.
To attack Israel.
And Lebanon. Yeah.
So, I mean, the question is, all I can see from the evidence presented by Avner, which is quite extraordinary. I mean, he quotes Igal Kamran, the former head of Israeli military intelligence, but also the founder and the executive director of MEMRI, the Middle East Media Research Institute, who I had the pleasure of working for many years ago, back in 2000 in Washington, D.C., and quotes him as really as a kind of backup source regarding this. So the question is, obviously the Iranians can contest Israel's missile defense system, this time to see how they are capable of dealing with a drone attack, but also with a cruise missile attack and a ballistic missile attack, in the event that they can put on those missiles a kind of nuclear payload. But it's also a way for the Iranian regime to save face, the Americans to save face and say, look, diplomacy won, we de-escalated a potential war in the Middle East, and this doesn't endanger Joe Biden's re-election chances, whether he is able to stand come November as the Democratic presidential nominee. That's a whole different program in itself. But I mean, this is a very kind of dangerous politics, isn't it? To be playing with this, to be playing with people's lives, and also the huge cost to the Israeli taxpayer in defending Israel on the night of the 13th and the 14th of April, and really has shot to bits Israel's deterrent capabilities as well.
I mean, we need to remember, go back to that figure, $1 billion, 804 million pounds. That's what it cost Israel. What it cost Iran is peanuts in comparison, because it only takes a few $1,000s to create these drones. Okay, the cruise and the ballistic missiles maybe quite a bit more, but it really hemorrhaged money out of the Israeli coffers to deal with all of this. Plus, you've got whatever the Allies spent intercepting. And let's be real here. All of the combined forces of those nations, Israel, United States, France, UK, and Jordan, did bring down the bulk of these projectiles. It's great, and all part of their elbow. But it's the response to it that we've been looking at as we've talked through this evening is, has Israel actually created some sort of deterrence that would prevent Iran from doing it again? And there is a major question mark over that concept.
And also the great danger, I think, isn't there, with this one as well, is that America is seen as very weak. And this has been the problem over the past 4 years, is that perception that America is weak under Biden. There is no deterrent capabilities, that when Washington speaks, there's no power to back up Washington's words. And I think this is also, Putin also worked this out very quickly when he decided to invade the Ukraine. We know that the American administration is so risk adverse, afraid of going to war no matter cost, that are actually appeasing the most world's evil dictators, such as the Iranian regime. And why do they still believe that they can negotiate with the Iranians over its nuclear weapons program, knowing that the Iranians never followed the guidelines of the nuclear agreement that was produced in 2015, knowing that Iran hasn't stopped its support for international terrorism, knowing that the Iranian regime has not stopped its persecution and oppression against women and against Christians and other minority groups, and is backing the Houthis, is backing Hamas, is backing Hezbollah, is cultivating the new leadership of Al-Qaeda, and even helped to form and support Al-Qaeda in Iraq, that then later became ISIS.
I think, Simon, I think there's two quick answers to that. In that there just is within the Biden administration, there is the vain hope, if we try again, this time it might work. So let's try again, just in case the Iranians might change their mind if we offer them another few billion. But there's also the fact that Islamic theology is not taken into account by anybody in any Western capital. And that's what is driving the regime in Tehran, Islamic theology, end times theology in particular. And Western governments are so secular and so many of them anti-God of any shape, size or form that they will not bring that into the equation when they're dealing with the regime in Iran.
Absolutely. So let's have a look at this excellent new video produced by the Israeli Foreign Ministry, and that's a warning to the West that we need to stop Iran now.
جمهوری اسلامی تل آویو و حیفا رو با خاک یکسان خواهد کرد.
So I want to thank our friends at the Israeli Foreign Ministry warning Britain and the rest of the world about Iran's ballistic missile threat. Robin, thank you so much for being my guest on Behind Headlines. Done a great job, thank you. And I want to thank you for watching at home. The one thing the Iranian regime hasn't calculated into its thinking, when it comes against Israel, it comes against the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. And that's something to be fearful. So thank you for watching tonight's edition of Behind Headlines.